thanks everyone for being here. The image that you see on the first slide of my presentation is a photo of the Palace of Justice in Idlib. Now this photo was captured on the 16th of August 2015, and this is moments after it was targeted by a government warplane trying to level the building. Now, what you don't see in the photo is that a few months before, when rebel groups captured the city, Jaysh al-Fatah, which was a coalition of rebel groups that captured the city, placed their troops around the building trying to protect it. And this strikes as bizarre because the building stands as a symbol of oppression and injustice, so why would opposition groups try to protect it? And a few months after that incident, Jaysh al-Fatah issues a list of 750 names of people who informally but yet closely collaborated and were associated with the government. So what the rebels were trying to do is trying to protect the documents, reports, and archives found within the building to reveal these informal associations. Now what this also shows is that rebel groups understand how to establish effective control in a society, the monopoly of violence is not sufficient, especially in Syria. What they had to do, they had to reveal these informal networks that served as that extended the state's institutional reach in a way. So if we agree, it seems that the pre-existing social order in Syria was not only defined by the institutions of violence and coercion, but also by these informal networks. So if we agree that it seems that these informal networks and associations are undergoing significant transformations. The case of Idlib is one example of direct pressure from opposition groups trying to reveal these informal networks and also obliterate them. That was evident by the by the violence that followed after capturing Idlib. So a lot of people look at the violence and they see just moments of madness and vengeance and sectarianism, but in fact the violence was associated with these strategic elements. So there's this element of direct pressure from opposition groups trying to reveal these informal networks and obliterate them. On the other hand, there are a number of other factors as well that put these informal networks under direct pressure as well. And these factors include, such as, for instance, collapsed economies and the depreciation of the Syrian currency, which undermines the financial incentives or motivations that the regime used to keep contact with these, to keep its social influence in a way. And just to give you an interesting example, for instance, up until today, the regime still keeps the payroll going of those who used to work in the public sector, even if they live in rebel-held areas, provided that they travel to government-held territories and collect their paychecks. Now this doesn't happen that often these days because of the currency. So it lost its value, sort of. There are also a number of other factors, for instance, the massive internal displacement of people, which puts a lot of pressure on these pre-existing connections. At the same time, the hardening of identities, which leads to shifting loyalties and whatnot. So if we agree, if we establish that these informal networks were a defining feature of the pre-existing social order, and if we agree that these informal networks are undergoing significant transformations, then by default we establish that the social order in general is undergoing some significant transformations as well. And with that, I want to introduce the broad question that my research addresses. My presentation is in service of this question, but I will try to develop it during the duration of my fellowship. Broadly speaking, I'm asking questions about the social order. Is there any order at all in the midst of this violence and chaos? And what kind of a social order is emerging? So the hypothesis that I put forward is that amidst this violence and chaos, there is a significant, considerable autonomy and influence that religious organizations gain at the level of local governance. So I will briefly highlight this hypothesis, develop it as much as I can at this stage, and then I will move on to discussing about the role of religion in society in Syria before 2011. And here this I do for the sake of sort of juxtaposing or comparing and contrasting what was the role of religion before 2011 and what's happening today. Now, I do this because there is, in the literature, the the cutting edge research, if you like, that emerged, people that are also mentioned in the bibliography that is going to go around. Most of the focus is on the growing autonomy and influence of religious organizations in Syria and how they have gained a certain bargaining power and level of influence even on a political level. But the gap is there isn't any follow-up on this research. So if it is true that the religious organizations gain such an influence and presence, how is that manifesting in today's situation? Is that completely gone? Or is it playing out or manifesting in a certain way? So I look into themes of continuity and change between the pre-2011 situation and the post-2011 situation. And I ask a question, could there be a causality? So in the publications that you would read about the topic, there's always this dancing around the bush sort of a thing where there are connections that are being made, how this previously existing autonomy or growing influence of religion is connected to the rise of radicalized groups, let's say. But there isn't any evidence for it. The arguments are always nuanced, the arguments are always sort of complicated without any direct evidence. But is there a sign of causality? What kind of a connection, what kind of a relation are we talking about? So this will be my research in the next couple of years, and I will talk about it as much as I can today. Now, staying in Idlib, the parallel to the armed conflict that is going on between combatants and armed factions, there is a hidden and equally complicated competition going on at the local level, at the level of local governance in Syria. And here the competition is over local resources, is over local influence, and establishing social patronage, which will also lead to the legitimization of the armed forces that are in play. So the parties to this competition are many, and the most basic actor, if you like, the protagonists, are the local councils. And there are more than 100 local councils. These are both city and town level councils. They enjoy a relative degree of autonomy and some resources as well. Now, it differs from one council to the other depending on what kind of businesses exist in these localities. Also, it depends on what kind of connections they have to the international aid industry. Now, these local councils are mostly focusing on their own localities, which gives them a sense of sort of dissociation from the armed parties. And this has been one of the main reasons why international aid organizations have preferred to work through these councils to distribute aid, amongst many other actors as well. Now, the services that these local councils have taken over are municipal services that are also state functions. And at face value, if you like, these seen as apolitical. When you talk about governance, the usual assumption is that it's different than government and it's not associated with power relations. But that's not necessarily the case. Even the most simplest municipal services, such as the distribution of electricity and water, maintaining sanitation, collecting litter, they have huge implication on establishing dependencies within these localities. It also establishes some sort of a legitimacy of these bodies of governance with regards to the population that they're trying to manage. So parallel to the local councils, there are the two main factions. I talked about Jaysh al-Fatah. Jaysh al-Fatah was a coalition of many armed factions. Today, this Jaysh al-Fatah is basically divided into two factions. One is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and the other one is Harakat Ahrar al-Sham. And these factions, without going much into detail, have developed their own separate civilian bodies of coordination that are competing with the local councils as well. So we're trying to provide similar services, distributing electricity, water, and whatnot. On another level, these factions have also developed their own judicial system, judiciary in a way, and these are through Islamic courts. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham subscribes to what is called Dar al-Qada, and Harakat Tahrir al-Sham is subscribed to a network of Islamic courts known as the Sharia Commissions. Now, these religious entities, or this religious framework, is directly associated with the armed factions. So their presence and influence is contingent upon these armed factions. But yet again, in the way they operate, they do also enjoy a significant influence over the local populations. For instance, if a local council is going to use the Bab al-Hawa crossing, which is the main crossing between Turkey and Idlib, to bring in aid or goods, for instance, the signature and approval of both of these courts are required. And signatures and approvals do not come cheap. They always come with strings attached to them. So there were a lot of reports, for instance, how these courts have even influence on the educational content that is provided through these local councils. And I also mentioned how the government even tries to maintain some sort of a social influence by keeping the payroll going with those who used to work in the public sector, such as public schools. Now, what this example shows, instead of sort of supporting my hypothesis, is it shows how the religious entities are a part of many other actors who are competing for social influence and social presence. But the reason why I think the hypothesis stands and has value is not only because of what's going on in rebel-held areas, but mostly because of what's going on in government-held areas, where the state has become so exhausted and busy with the fighting that it has also sort of surrendered its state functions to local entities. And here I want to focus on religious organizations active in Aleppo. Just a few examples that I can give, for instance, which I mentioned in my research proposal that you guys have read. The Armenian Protestant church in Aleppo City, for instance, has started giving away, distributing electricity. Again, a simple apolitical service, if you think about it, but yet again, in terms of social influence, it provides household-to-household access, and access that is far beyond, it far exceeds what the access that they used to have before the Civil War. There are also other examples, for instance, of the Greek Orthodox Church in Aleppo City that does receive aid from international organizations and also distributes them on Sunday after Mass. A clear effort of targeted charity, not random acts of charity, but trying to increase their social constituency and their reach in the areas. So the reason why I will, in the next couple of years during the duration of my fellowship, I'm going to focus on Aleppo is, one, I have already conducted research in Aleppo, so I do have some context. But most importantly, methodologically speaking, Aleppo is a very interesting, as you already know, is a very interesting methodologically and analytically good place to study the complexity of these religious organizations and their connections to local government. As you know, Aleppo is quite diverse. So it has many different religious communities, it has different religious organizations. And by looking at the way in which different communities, different religious organizations have taken on these government functions, we can complicate the picture a little bit more and be a bit more accurate in highlighting the role of religion after 2011. So the research tasks that I intend to take on are identifying the active religious organizations on the ground, identifying the type of services and activities they provide, also identifying their networks of aid distribution, the ways in which they distribute their aid. I also focus on, I want to do my interviews with aid recipients, those who are receiving the aid. And do they only receive aid through religious organizations? Did they have contacts with these religious organizations before 2011? So the operational time frame is very important here as a focus of mine. But also international aid organizations who are cooperating with what they label as faith-based organizations. I argue they're not faith-based organizations, they're religious organizations. Their charity is always targeted. It is based on basic affiliation. So these are the questions that I intend to develop over the next couple of years. Now, before I get into the role of religion in Syria before 2011, I think it's a good opportunity for us in the project and also for those who came to follow the presentation for the sake of clarity to go through the key concepts that I use. And here I don't have much time to do this, but I am intentionally putting myself in the line of fire, fishing for critical feedback and reactions from you. So the first concept that I rely on is social order. It's a term that you have heard me use a number of times already. Social order, I use this definition from Eric Carlton from his quintessential ideology on social order. In it he says, social order is about positional arrangements of social, and I'm quoting him here, positional arrangements of social groups in relation to each other according to a particular pattern or method. Excuse me. And in my research, I place the emphasis on power relations between different social groups in society, for instance, power groups and power relations that develop between religious organizations, religious entities, religion, and society. Now here, by doing this, I am breaking from the traditional state-centric approaches of looking into social ordering. For instance, Carlton also elaborates how in modern Western political thought, thinkers seem preoccupied with social organization in the context of post-Westphalian modernity. And here, by looking into the state as the ultimate structure that defines social order. and social order as studying the relations between the rulers and the ruled. Now, this is also evident in the literature about politics and the state in Syria, for instance. If you look into the school of thought of authoritarianism or authoritarian upgrading, it is heavily state-centric. So the main question concerns the reason or purpose of justifying or dividing society between rulers and ruled, and the methods in which these end up becoming successful methods of establishing social order. Now, I'm not saying these to criticize the state-centric approach. If anything, it sort of highlights how the state is an important, significant entity that has an influence on the social order. So when I talk about the social order in the context of power relations between religion and society, I also take into account the role that the state takes, the nature of the state, how it tries to intervene in these power relations, how it tries to shape them, whatnot. So that's the second element. And the third element is not necessarily keeping up with the approach of not taking the state as the starting point of analysis. For instance, Marx also, in his conception of the social order, his point of analysis does not start from the state. It starts from the economic base, the economic modes of production. And from that approach, he talks about the stratification of society and how the economic modes of production shape social relations, different levels of the proletariat, different levels of the bourgeoisie. But also he talks about the state as a superstructure. So his point of analysis starts from the economic modes of production. And in the Syrian case, with the post-2000 developments that I'm focusing on, the year 2000 is quite crucial because it does represent that sharp turn towards the neoliberal economic policies. So I'm looking at the relations between society, religion and society, the influence of the state, but also all this happening while these parties and these relations are undergoing significant transformations as an outcome of the economic modes of production that are changing and introducing new inconsistencies and new unsubtleties in society. The second term is institutional domain, and I use this to talk about religion as an institutional domain. And here, this is what I find the main agreement with Haris, the work that you do, mostly understanding religion not only as an actor, as a social actor, but also challenging this monolithic conception of religion as a homogeneous entity. So focusing on, first of all, the pluralistic composition of religion as a field that is comprised of many interest groups that interact and compete within religion and through religion as well. So I take religion as an institutional domain, meaning the social field, but also as a social actor in society through its organizational framework. And perhaps the most important concept, and the last one that I highlight today, is that of informal networks. Now, informal networks, defining informal networks is quite a challenge because by the character of informality, usually in the literature they are defined in relation to a context to give it some sort of a formality. So I'm going to define it in relation to the social order in Syria before 2011. And before 2011, these informal networks were basically local clients, regime affiliates, and regime dependents that have established a mutual dependency or mutual interest in patron-client relations with the regime. And these relationships came over decades of selective partnerships by the regime of influential local families, of local businesses, and even influential religious figures. So in return of their loyalty and service, these local clients received advantages and privileges. And this establishes some sort of a mutual interest in maintaining the status quo of this patron-client relations. The informal character of these networks comes from their ability not to be confined by their organizational or occupational roles. In the words of Bassam Haddad, who looks into business networks in a very influential work of his, business networks in Syria, he, for instance, says how informal networks bring together strange partners or bedfellows for short or long-term goals and objectives. So the function of these networks, at least before 2011, was to extend the state's institutional reach. And I was giving the example of Idlib. And what that means is, on one hand, it allows top-down access into localities in areas that are deemed marginal or inaccessible by the state by its power centers. But it also at the same time allows for bottom-up resource circulation. And here by resource I mean they could be economic resources, as in the business networks that Bassam Haddad highlights. They could be social by the dependencies and the habits that they establish in the relations that they nurture and develop. They could also be obviously political, because they project the image of a legitimate state that has some sort of a social representation nationwide, but also ability to of effective governance, because they can mobilize these informal networks for different purposes. So the framework of informal networks, I'm relating it to the regime itself, but they don't necessarily have to be developed or associated with the regime. Informal networks, or patron-client relations, if you like, may develop even in the religious field, through social dependencies, through, for instance, I'm going to focus on charity associations. Now, conceptually, this is quite an important term in my research, because this is what allows to complicate the idea of a social order, or the idea of religion as to highlight its pluralistic composition. Entities or groups that are not necessarily confined by organizational structures. For instance, connections that are made between the religious entities and business networks. These are two different domains, the economy and religion, but yet again, strong associations exist between certain social groups within these different domains. So what informal networks allows is it allows to go beyond the confines of the organizational structures that define both the social order and its institutional domain. So with that, we get to the last part of this presentation, and this is the main focus that I have today. The role of religion in Syria between 2000 and 2011. Now it's hard, I know it's cliche and you've probably heard it a million times, but it's hard to talk about the role of religion in society in Syria without mentioning the 1982 moment, or the Hama uprising. And very briefly, this was about the Muslim Brotherhood in an active rebellion taking over the city of Hama, and the government basically responding by destroying half the city and killing tens of thousands of people. The implications of the Hama uprising were that political Islam was basically obliterated from Syrian society. It didn't have any public manifestation anymore. And the religious activities were confined to dawah, or the proselytization. They became apolitical in nature, and also sometimes used as a legitimation tactic by the religious leadership that were nurtured by the regime itself. And here, for instance, one famous example is the late Sheikh Muhammad Said Ramadan al-Bouti, who also explicitly supports and endorses the regime. And there are also contemporary examples, for instance, such as Sheikh Badruddin Hassan and whatnot. Another feature of the post-1982 position of religion in society is that the activity of religious organizations was mostly confined to the urban centers, and mostly in Damascus, close to the political elite. Now, after 2000, the literature highlights a number of significant transformations. First of all, we had a growing religious activism in the fields of religion, education, and socio-economic fields as well. This was used to highlight the autonomy that religion gained vis-a-vis the state, a certain level of bargaining power with the state. And at the same time, people talked about, the scholars pinpointed how there was an expanding social presence and influence even beyond the urban centers by religious organizations. So I'm going to develop these points, if you like, through a focus on religious charity organizations in Syria, to talk about them in detail. And I talk about four main points. First of all, I highlight the background, not for the sake of highlighting the background of religious charity organizations, but to talk about what sort of political function they have. The second point that I want to raise is the connection between the neoliberal turn and the growth and expansion of religious charity organizations. Why did that come about? How did that come about? And the third factor is about the way in which these religious charity organizations and associations became significant socio-economic actors, and mostly by highlighting their ability to have financial autonomy, but also through targeted charity. And the last section highlights about the backlash, when the state sort of realized the growing influence of religious organizations. It was not very happy with it, so they tried to curb their influence in society. So religious charity associations, in its very basic definition, are institutions or organizations established to help those in need. Their practices consist of traditional charity activities, such as, for instance, giving food to those who need it. And they also include development projects, and this keeps up with the motto of instead of giving people food, you teach them how to fish, for example. And the main difference is that development projects require tremendous commitment and resources to carry out. It is a long-term project, and not all charity organizations are able to carry them out. Charity associations in Syria have a number of defining features, and I will go through this in detail. There are both formal and informal organizations, and by formal I mean those who are registered with the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor, and informal, those who are either working underground or those who are working under the auspices of a religious organization. So they are their own association, they have their own board of directors, and they have their own, they are their own entity, but they are not registered and they work as an extension of churches or mosques. But they also have, the vast majority of these religious associations, and I'm going to go through the numbers as well, have a religious affiliation, either setting up their mission through a religious framework for a religious purpose, or being directly associated with religious leaders through the board of directors, the members in the board of directors, through the networks through which they go about distributing their aid, and also through the venues in which they do their fundraising, through church gatherings and mosque gatherings and whatnot. And the third feature of charity associations in Syria is their local focus. They have a strong, their functions, there are a number of very famous associations, charity associations in Syria that work nationwide, but numerically the vast majority of them work in neighborhoods, in localities. And this has significant implications, as we will come to. Now, the background of religious charity associations in Syria, this is basically the period, the 10 years between 1952 and 1962, and this was known as the golden age of religious charity associations. And as you can see, the numbers grew from 73 in 1952 to 596 in 1962. Now, after independence in Syria, 1946, if you ask me, 1945, if you ask Professor Aziz and a few of my friends, Syria was quite an open society. So these entities, associations, civil society, and so forth, were flourishing. Now, so this indicates how these religious charity associations were present. But as soon as measures of regulation and systems of licensing were introduced, all of a sudden the numbers started becoming visible. So why I'm saying this, just to highlight how a lot of organizations were established in the 50s, but a lot of them were already present and active informally. But by introducing measures of regulations and registration, they became visible, and they weren't established overnight. So there were a number of measures, both public and private, of regulating these associations. And public measures included, for instance, the establishment of the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor in 1955, and passing laws like Law Number 93, which required associations to register and also declare their sources of funding. There are also a number of other private measures to regulate these associations, for instance, the establishment of the Damascus and Aleppo Charities Unions. And these are private associations, but then again, they have similar measures of regulating and rendering associations more formal and more visible. Now, why formalize? Why is this formalization? On one hand, what charity associations gain by formalizing is they have access to the state framework. So they have new options, if you like. They have access to certain resources that the state is willing to give away. But on the other hand, what it does is that these religious associations all of a sudden find themselves in a web of bureaucratic practices and legal codes. So it introduces new restrictions and regulations that they have to navigate. So they lose a little bit of their freedom and hoping to get more resources, if you like. But what it does to power structures or to the bureaucracy is it gives the bureaucracy a certain vision by rendering these organizations visible. And by having them be visible, they have access to information to segments of society that are usually the most marginalized, the socio-economically poor and whatnot. So they have access and they have indirect influence through regulations over those who work with charities, the charities themselves, those who work with charities, and also those who receive aid. Now after 1963, and this is the Ba'athist takeover, the charity associations, the number of charity associations, at least the formal ones, declined. And here just a footnote, I should have mentioned it earlier. The numbers I am giving you, they come from 3 different sources. They come numbers from the Ministry of Social Affairs and Justice. They come from the Central Bureau of Statistics. And also I made these graphs based on the numbers that are given by 3 main scholars in the field who have focused extensively on the British Charity Association. And these are Thomas Pierre, Laura Luis de Alvira, and then the Khatib. And they all have they all have their numbers from the same sources of the Ministry of Social Affairs and Justice and the Central Bureau of Statistics. If you try to go back to these numbers, you don't find them online anymore. But the reason why I consider them consistent, consider them reliable, is they focus on different numbers for different years, and if you do the graphs separately, they are all consistent. So based on that consistency, I think these numbers are quite accurate, more or less. So after the Ba'athist takeover, the number of formal associations declined. And this reflects the transformations that happened in state-society relations. So all of a sudden, the Ba'athist state was responsible for social welfare. And having charity associations sort of undermined the image of the Ba'athist state. Having charity associations taking on social responsibilities implied that the state is unable to take them, is unable to live up to the image that it set itself to live up to. So these state responsibilities and social services were carried out through unions and state institutions. Now the period during the neoliberal turn, this is the true golden age of religious charity associations. We have some sort of an exponential growth. In the period of 9 years, between 2000 and 2009, the number triples from a little bit over 500 to about 1,500 religious charity associations in general. So this brings us to the second point, which is the neoliberal turn and its association with the growth and expansion of religious charity organizations. Now, in post-2000s, the neoliberal turn is quite a cliche term, and it's quite broad in general. What it stands for in Syria is, first of all, introducing very cheap Infertile, an economic opening, if you like, introducing cheap products, foreign products, with which the local production could not compete. At the same time, there were measures of privatization. And of course, the privatization measures always favored crony business people who were associated with the political elite. At the same time, the government kept cutting down subsidies and tax cuts. And this was happening while the country was going through a severe drought, which led to the movement of more than 300,000 families from the rural countryside into the urban centers, which also weighed heavily on market dynamics and unemployment rate within the urban centers. So in light of all this, while the regime was trying to sort of diversify its income and its resources, there were huge socio-economic issues happening in certain segments of society. And all of a sudden, the state shifts from being the main agent for the distribution of welfare and provider of social welfare into a social market economy, following the Chinese model. But what it implied is the government was basically encouraging the rise of the private sector, both in the economy and the rise of the associated sector in social welfare, charities such as charity associations. And that's evident through formal declarations in the 10th Five-Year Plan, where the government explicitly wants to encourage private, incentivize, and offer financial, technical, and human resources to such enterprises. So before 2000, Syrians were expected to report their socioeconomic problems to the party or the state. And in return, they received subsidies, reduced taxes, social services. After the year 2000, all of a sudden, they were supposed to report their socioeconomic problems to family networks, private organizations, charity organizations, religious leaders, and religious organizations. And the services that they received in return through these channels was financial aid. Again, this is charity associations and what kind of services they provide. And again, it is divided between the traditional, charity activities and also the developmental charity activities of a developmental nature. And these include financial aid, financing religious education, short-term employment, food packages, care, medical treatment. But what was most significant is how charity associations were all of a sudden taking on developmental projects, which, as I said, require tremendous dedication and resources. So these included financial assistance to newly married couples, financial and educational assistance to large families, training courses, literacy courses, and granting microcredits. So all of a sudden, charity associations were trying to curb unemployment, for instance. And they did carried out these activities through a local expansion, which in their day-to-day activities allowed them to have develop direct interpersonal relations within their localities. Here we're talking about face-to-face exchanges and follow-ups, neighborhood meetings, fundraising in mosques and gatherings. And just an example of how the beneficiaries and the people who received the aid also increased. Sanduq al-Afia and Sanduq al-Mawadda wal-Rahma, these are two projects initiated by the same charity organization, which is the Damascus Charities Union. And this is a charity organization that works nationwide. And you ask me, why am I focusing on, I want to focus on locality. I'm giving you the example of another formalized entity association that is working nationwide. And that's because of the same, they're formalized, their numbers are easy to access, whereas the informal ones are harder. So you can see how their numbers sort of went tenfold almost in the period of 10 years. Harout, which is a private charity association based in Damascus, has had an increase of its own permanent beneficiaries as well. Now these are permanent beneficiaries, which means those who are those who are subscribed to these charity associations receive these aids on a rolling basis, on a continuous basis. But of course there are also others who receive them on a temporary basis. And this gives you a hint of the ability of these charity associations, which raises the question, where's the money coming from? Which brings us to the third point about religious charity organizations as socio-economic actors. How did they emerge as socio-economic actors? And I argue that they do so through, first of all, financial autonomy, and second, through targeted charity. Now the sources of funding, and here I'm focusing on Islamic charity organizations, are predominantly from religious gatherings, but also through the connections of the local business networks with the religious associations. And here Thomas Pierre has a very interesting statement where he says, middle-class merchant and sheikh are two different occupational roles of people coming from the same socio-economic class. And that's an interesting thought, because it highlights sort of class formation processes that led to both sheikhs, religious figures, and merchants, the middle-class business people, to have this sort of connection. And it's interesting that there are examples that show this. For instance, the Zayd movement, which is an Islamic charity association that has access to a network of mosques and also schools in Damascus, is managed by Al-Rifai family, which contains both sheikhs and also very wealthy business people. So there is that connection that Thomas Pierre highlights, but at the same time there is a symbiotic relationship between business people and religious organizations. Being endorsed or giving charity to a religious organization is symbolic of some sort of endorsement by the religious organization of the business itself. So it's a marketing tool in a way. It allows these businesses to have access to the religious networks. It also improves their image. And on the other hand, religious organizations gain a degree of autonomy, of financial autonomy, since they don't come, the money does not come with political strings attached to it. So that gave the religious associations, Islamic religious organizations, a degree of autonomy. Now these connections did not come overnight. For instance, I gave the example of the Zayd movement. Abdul Karim al-Rifai, which was the founder of the Zayd movement, for instance, had decades of active efforts trying to develop these connections, and they did them up until 2011, 2010, where, for instance, they conduct religious seminars targeted to the wealthy middle-class business people, those who run their businesses. For instance, talking about Islamic principles of economics and trade, Islamic banking, and so on and so forth. So this is another example of how they sort of try to outreach and develop these connections with the middle class. Christian charity associations, on the other hand, were also innovative. They, for instance, focused on services that sort of are supported by a cross-section of society in general. For instance, services such as helping the disabled. And this was evident by how even the Assad family, for instance, Asma al-Assad, through her organizations, Firdaus and Mawlid, sort of even started cooperating with such religious organizations. They also, such Christian organizations also cooperated with international Western organizations, such as the Catholic Relief Services. Now, this also highlighted. This was also highlighted in the period when you had the influx of Iraqi refugees into Syria. Now, the government, the regime, had its own framework to define where the money to help these people is going to come from. It's because there were a number of international organizations who are willing to help and provide assistance. And these were about 14 international NGOs that mostly worked through the Syrian Arab Red Crescent Society. Interestingly, Christian organizations had partnered with entities that were outside of the legal framework, such as UNICEF and UNHCR, and this went on up until 2010 when the government decided that was about enough. So this sort of raises the question about how these connections came about. When an international organization like UNHCR or UNICEF are going to partner up with a local entity, how does trust come about? Is it just established overnight? Does this mean that there were these connections developing through such services through the disabled? How could Christian charity associations have the advantage, sort of, to get these aid and distribute them through their own networks? Now, Christian charity associations were mostly based in Aleppo and Damascus. An interesting fact at Heed is that they represented 20% of charitable associations. That was in 2002 in the post-Ba'athist period. And that represents quite an overrepresentation of the segment of society that only represents 10%. So on one hand, this highlights how within the religious community, the divide within the religious communities, how religious charity association was sort of associations were tools to increase the prestige of religious figures, of religious associations. But at the same time, they sort of highlight their basic affiliation. At the end of the day, they are religious organizations and not necessarily faith-based organizations, because they serve the ones who actually, people who belong to have the same religious, ethnic, regional affiliation. So this also highlights their ability of becoming a sort of actor within their communities, within their localities. So one thing is to look at the 20% ratio of Christian associations and say it represents an overrepresentation of Christian charities, but on the other side of the coin, it also indicates an underrepresentation of Islamic charities. And this also shows how the state even uses religious charity associations, or the religious field, to sort of extend its power through favoritism and through indirect influence in a way. In other words, when Christian charity organizations had sort of the regime turned a blind eye to funding received from international organizations that were not a part of the legal framework, Islamic charity organizations were not allowed the legal power. And in fact, they were not allowed through quite violent methods as well. For instance, in 2008, when the government completely banned informal associations in general, not only those who got funding from outside, but even, for instance, informal charity associations, or informal, for instance, Sharia schools were shut down. But not only that, but even those who would associate with these entities were in prison. For instance, one of my interviewees from my previous research from Deir ez-Zor had a first cousin of his who was imprisoned because he went to, he attended a Sharia school that was informal, that was not registered with the government. So it's not just the government sort of trying to suppress these organizations through these organizations, but also using these organizations to get to the people that it wants to target. So what the government was trying to do by favoring the Christian associations is they were trying to give it relative autonomy and freedom of action in exchange for tacit approval and support. I have a few examples of how targeted charity actually works. Now, it's a fine line that religious charity associations try to walk. On one hand, they have their basic affiliations, and they can be easily labeled as sectarian. But on the other hand, if they don't do that, they start sort of stepping on other people's toes. All of a sudden, you're getting into other communities, and you could be, labeled as somebody who's trying to proselytize in other areas, in other communities. So, religious associations have taken on a number of steps to make this sort of to walk this fine line. Right, Salam, which is a Syria Catholic organization, an informal one based in Aleppo. For instance, in their board of directors, they appoint 1 out of 7 who has to be a Muslim. And in the ratio of beneficiaries of the people that they provide aid to, 1 in 33 has to be Muslim. So it's quite insignificant, but what they're doing is they're saying, we're not sectarian. But, they are. Similar steps were taken by St. Vincent de Paul. For instance, permanent beneficiaries were exclusively for Christians. But they did take a number of temporary beneficiaries who happened to be Muslims on condition that they had applied to Muslim charity associations and had been rejected. Now the backlash, the state trying to come back, I'm going to take you to that period of exponential growth. The number of 1,500, before 2000, the vast majority of associations were religious charity associations, with a few exceptions of, for instance, sports associations or cultural associations. But numerically, the biggest proportion were religious charity associations. After the year 2002, only 60% of this huge number were religious charity associations. So all of a sudden, you can see that the government was trying to sort of promote a civil society, or what is called a civil society. And you had a number of non-governmental organizations, which were ironically called government-organized non-governmental organizations in the literature, where the government was trying to promote environmental, cultural, developmental associations. And one reason is because how the regime was trying to find local partners to help with the socio-economic challenges. But another reason that could be attributed is that it was trying to curb the growing influence of religious associations on society and creating some sort of a competition between the religious charity associations and other entities, other developmental entities. And the examples that I want to give today is, for instance, of the connection between the so-called civil society and the regime are a couple of examples. For instance, Diyar al-Hajj Arif, which was the minister of the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor between 2004 and 2011, during her tenure in 2008 establishes her own NGO, and that's called Tumuhi. Asma al-Asad, for instance, I mentioned Firdos, for instance, one of her NGOs, established the Syrian Young Entrepreneurs Association. And I'm giving you these two examples because they were both co-funded and co-founded by Abdeslam Haikal, a wealthy businessman closely associated to the Assad clique. So this shows how these developments were closely associated with the regime. And all of a sudden the regime trying to sort of counterbalance the growing religious organizational expansion. These are also evident through the Uqud Tasharruqiyya, which are basically measures of privatization, government contracts, long-term lease, measures of privatization, if you like, that went again to the crony business that are associated, wealthy businessmen that are closely associated to the regime. And one famous example of this is Rami Makhlouf, the first cousin of Bashar al-Assad. And he received the contract for Jamiyat al-Bustan al-Khairiyya, which is based in Tacky, providing medical help. Now, these efforts were quite inefficient in curbing the influence of religious charity organizations for a number of reasons. The main reason is that these business people were mostly motivated by corporate social responsibility. So the objective of their involvement was profit, and which means that their involvement was limited as well. So that was inefficient to curb unemployment in general. But also a significant factor of how their influence was limited is how their operational framework was based on some sort of a cultural professionalism, favoring international experience. Their employment, they employed well-educated people coming from the middle classes. So all this did not give these entities the same locality, the same informality, the same access as religious charity organizations had developed. Now, what this is my last slide. I've been talking for far too long. What I want to highlight here is there are a number of patterns that emerge in the way in which religious organizations are sort of being active and functional after 2011, and the way in which religious organizations were active before. And these include, for instance, political quietism, similar to the dissociation of local councils or religious entities from the armed factions. I'm talking about government-held areas. This effort of being sort of trying to be finding space, operational space, to operate. But at the same time, there are clear similarities when it comes to financial independence and finding resources that enhance this space, this operational space. And also through the localities, expanding connections and access, which is an ongoing process and has similarities to the pre-existing role of and position of religion in Syria, but also through the direct methods of outreach and social dependency. Now, these do not establish causality, obviously, but what they might indicate is that when the superstructure, when the state is going through a moment of crisis, society might be falling back to its local structures of organization. Now, thank you for listening. I will be developing these ideas in the next 2 years, and hopefully I will have more concrete findings to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Harout. For me, it was really fascinating, and I learned a lot, especially from the conceptual and methodological approach that you are using to this research. I have a few questions, but since we are together, like our offices near to each other, so I won't raise all those questions. I just want to ask if you could elaborate more on the relationship between religious charity groups and armed groups in the areas that are not controlled by the government, because the basic question is how the social order is being recreated. And I think you explained very well that the charity and social welfare is part of this process, but there is the process of establishing the monopoly of violence. And that's exactly what the armed groups are doing. And I mean, at the end, you touched upon this issue, talking about the dissociation from the armed groups, but in those areas, how the two elements of recreating the social order are going on. What are the relationship between charity groups and the armed groups? And we know that the armed groups, in a way, also are creating the social order through fighting, because fighting, creating boundaries, exchanging populations, all those processes are part of this dynamic. So I wonder if you could elaborate more, especially that you focus a lot on the locality, but when it comes to armed groups, the locality is not, as it appears to me, probably I'm wrong, it's just an impression, it's not the only main factor. I mean, we are talking about groups that are supported by regional and external powers. So there must be some kind of tension and negotiation between locally based activity and those groups. And I will stop here.
Thanks for the question. So, for the areas that are controlled by the rebel groups, obviously this is a parallel process. The effort of trying to establish the monopoly of violence, and this has multiple layers too, because it's not only the government that the opposition groups are fighting, but there are also internal divisions. And as soon as the balance of power between different factions are sort of disrupted, there's always the chance of a certain rebel faction to take over. This was the scenario, for instance, after the Aleppo battle, where people started saying how Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is going to take over Ahrar al-Sham, and it was going to be the end of Ahrar al-Sham. So that obviously is a very important aspect of what's sort of shaping up the social order. But that's also connected to these efforts of establishing local governance. So it's not only about the fighting, but also about establishing control at the end of the day. Yes, through statements you hear rebel factions saying, oh, we want to oust the regime, but on the ground, and if you look at their operations, the military operations, what is happening is they're trying to consolidate their territories and the control that they have, either by expanding and creating buffer zones, by taking on defensive positions from the government in case it attacks, or by actually looking inside these territories and trying to reinforce and fortify themselves. And in that context, I think the locality is very important. One way to maintain legitimacy with the people, one way to have more resources. I mean, we were talking about both Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Ahrar al-Sham. They're either completely listed as terrorist organizations because of their connection to Jabhat al-Nusra, or partially connected to Jabhat al-Nusra, and some favor them and some don't. So resources, especially local cooperation, is very important for them. But at the same time, locality is important in terms of what kind of a social order these groups are trying to impose. For instance, a lot of them do strive, explicitly declare that they want to establish an Islamic state. An Islamic state is not established only through an Islamic court. So they, for instance, the education that is provided through these local councils are also very important. So that's where their focus on locality also comes from. We could talk about how that connects to social order from the perspective of Iberian, like monopoly of violence and legitimacy, and how these local measures of local governance, where they fit in for the monopoly of violence, and where they fit in as a legitimization tactic, the distribution of resources, but also connections, legitimacy, and whatnot. I think that would take a little bit longer, but I'm happy to do it. Maybe in an hour or so.
It was amazing.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I'm not supposed to run the session. So.
Oh, sorry.
Go
No,
after
please.
you. Go after.
Okay. I looked back. I didn't see you. Sorry. I didn't see you raise your hand. It was really great. Like the perspective you offered today. And my question is less to challenge you on theory, but more about scale.
Mm-hmm.
I more than agree that the Christian religious community was more regulated through charities, or charities there had an outer reach than the Islamic community.
Mm-hmm.
And it would seem as though it's about double the percentage, Christians 10%, but 20%. Mm-hmm. But as I lived it there, it felt like 10 times more, not just 10. I went to school, like high school, with Christian classmates. Like you always get this sense that whenever a Christian person needs help, there's always the church to help them. It was organized even more through the scouts. For example, the Christian community had scouts all along. The rest of the country didn't. And it could partially be because some even doubt the figure 10% of. Some say it's even maybe 5%. Mm-hmm. There are no accurate figures of what percentage Christians in Syria are. So what would you say about that? Do we have a good idea about scale between Christian and Muslim charities?
Yeah, thank you for that. That actually is a very important point, because one of the weakest points of the whole literature in general, and since I'm relying on these numbers, I am also susceptible to this critique. How accurate are these numbers? Even if they are accurate, these are based on formal numbers, those who are registered. So for instance, when you talk about 20% of charity associations are Christian, these are only the Christian organizations that are formalized and have registered. And as your experience demonstrates, there are a lot more of them that are informal. So the numbers are always more than even what they are showing. Now, it is a weakness, and I don't know how to address it, the question of scale. Because even the government formal figures are not necessarily accurate. Like if the Bureau of Statistics declares a number, yes, you can go and check its methodology, but you don't know how that took place. Similar to the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor, it is a ministry in a regime. What it declares and what it does not declare, for example. So I agree with the scale, but in terms of maybe it's even bigger than the numbers that I have. But overall, what I find is, however you look at it, the numbers do not undermine religious charity associations, but they sort of highlight how it's even more than the numbers you get there.
Yeah,
Can I follow up then on
Yeah,
this?
sure.
I had 3 questions, and that was the first question I wanted to ask, but so you answered this. My second question is of a very different nature. What you showed us in this really, I find it's fascinating research you are doing, and I think also at one point one should probably really have a special seminar to look precisely into how methodologically and in practice in the field you are putting together with on the one hand of how we have established figures and what you do with your research, because that is so crucial, and I think relate this very much open. But the question I would have is, so what you showed us today is that the religious charities you basically looked at their function, right? You look at how they work or don't work together with the business world, how they operate vis-a-vis the state, but an argument to be completely out, and I wonder whether it's simply because it's out of focus or whether your approach would not allow you to look into this, is that there may be some very humble motivations, namely that there are really religious organizations, institutions, especially in Syria with a very long tradition, that really are independent actors, you know what I mean, but who are driven by questions of solidarity, of welfare, of taking care of the weaker, orphanages, whatever you have, so which would not really fit as much as it convinces me what you say for the years from the 70s to 2000 that there is a utilitarian function. But there's obviously also another driving force. So is this a driving force and a legitimacy that they derive also then in their acceptance vis-a-vis outside groups? You mentioned the various UN, Red Cross and what have you groups, but also vis-a-vis the population. So by leaving this out, is this a strategic decision simply to be able to see what new patterns there are? So that's my first question. And my second question is, I don't know how to really frame this. So you call it new social order, and which is a very, you have to come up with something. So, but you didn't speak about it, and I'm ignorant in that field. So is this, is there a literature that also speaks about new social order? Is it something you use as an ascriptive tool, or is it indeed something of a political movement you're describing, or is it in more theoretical terms? Do you really think that what we are seeing as extremely unstable, fragmented political movements and situations that change and change drastically in the very few years as becoming so stabilized that this is the very basis of a new social order? I didn't get really how you both theoretically but also empirically work with this.
Why leave out matters of principle, for instance, that are motivators, like religious principles, trying to help out the poor and whatnot? I guess it is, I shouldn't have done that. I should have mentioned that, because it is a strong influencing factor, and it also plays out to legitimize these associations. They're not necessarily for the utilitarian purpose, but they also function as, you know, loyalty to the principles that they believe in, which also resonates with the local population. But what I find is these are not mutually exclusive. Yes, it could very well be that it doesn't have a utilitarian purpose, that people who are carrying out these activities are driven by, you know, goodwill and everything. But the nature of these activities by default grant them a certain leverage, social leverage, and establish certain social dependencies. And given that my objective today was to highlight these relations, I left out the solidarity, but I shouldn't have done that. I should mention that, and I will touch on that in my research. So I shouldn't leave it out. When it comes to social order, conceptually I take it from theories of social ordering, and the term social order is used interchangeably with social organization. And most of these are associated with methods of, again, organizing society and whatnot. But it is a very broad topic, it's a very broad label, conceptually, because it does, in the post-Westphalian system, we always talk about the state system, the global state system, or no matter how much transformations the state is undergoing, it still is a social order sort of defined by the state. So conceptually in the literature, most of the focus is on the state actors, but when it comes to empirical research, as you know, the more recent engagement with social order focus on non-governmental organizations, not like the NGOs, but more like, for instance, how certain entities gain the function of social organization beyond the state, looking at other factors, dynamics between multiple actors in multiple institutional domains. So the social order is quite broad. For instance, in Lebanon, when people talk about the social order, they talk about the state within the state, looking at the function of the state, its ability to sort of carry out its functions, but at the same time they talk about Hezbollah as an actor and how these dynamics shape the social order. At the same time focusing on different social actors, the role of religious communities, and so on. So it is a broad term. I guess, as you said, I have to use a term. I prefer social order over social organization, which is the other term that it's used interchangeably with, because I want to emphasize on a hierarchy, on the power relations, if you like, between different segments of society, between different organized groups. So whereas social organization, the focus is more on, for instance, the relation between the resources and resource distribution within communities and within power groups, which I also take into account in the way I engage with social order anyway. But the primary objective, I guess, is to look at the power relations that are emerging, the hierarchy sort of, if you like, within the existing actors.
So it's basically that, if I'm allowed just as a
Sure.
so it's not the new social order as you say in the title, but it's about new social order or ordering. Because
Yes.
I thought you are looking at was more driven by, because you didn't speak about it, the new social order, but it's basically about new social ordering actually.
Yes.
Then the way you describe. Okay, then that makes sense.
From now on, it will be the new social order.
Yeah. Oh no, no, new order, but it's okay.
I have a quick one. So,
Yes.
kind of following up on, or kind of think slightly related to Nadia's first question, which is that you kind of emphasize that these are not faith-based, but religious-based. And I mean, if you're focusing more on them being religious, why bring up the faith-based or?
Well, the term itself is quite predominant in the literature that talks about international aid organizations. International aid organizations do partner up with religious organizations, religious charity organizations, to circulate and provide the aid. And in their reports, internal memo or published reports, they always use the term faith-based organizations. And the reason why they do it is because they want to highlight how these are not, sort of take the focus away from that basic affiliation of religious organizations. Because if you use religious organization as a term, you're sort of emphasizing on how these organizations serve their own communities. And that is sort of, that contradicts the premise of international aid in general, which is supposed to reach wide society, which isn't supposed to favor a certain community over the others. So it's another label like governance, the way the term governance has been used, to sort of all of a sudden highlight an apolitical field. All of a sudden, religious organizations became faith-based organizations in the eyes of the international community, because they wanted to take them, because they wanted to perceive them as, apolitical, general, or neutral actors. So in my research, I do use the term religious organizations to take the question back to its political methods, and I don't use faith-based organizations. I only refer to it to sort of highlight this point, but without relying on it. Is that good?
Yeah.
Yes, please do.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. This is most interesting. I have quite a number of questions, but I'll only pose one.
Okay.
Before that, just a little comment in connection with what Nadia said. Of course, the question of solidarity, charity, in the ordinary and old-fashioned and generous sense is undoubtedly there. But of course, I think it would be necessary also to look at the way in which motivations of this kind and organizations which have been originally designed with this in mind, then come to cross with similar parallel activities or even modify their activities in line with the very highly ideological output which is being associated with the various forms of social action that take place in Syria. And I don't think this is something that we can in any way ignore. I would also say in this regard that my impression is that Christian organizations are less ideologically loaded than Muslim. But that's another question. Now, a very interesting correlation you made between the rise in numbers of the RCOs and progress of the neoliberal, the neoliberal destruction of the Syrian social and economic order under Bashar al-Assad, who actually came at a moment when these became the highlights of all economic activity universally. Now, what I would like you to help me with is the following. Now, if we assume, or if we are allowed to say that the state had previously been the vertical hinge of the social order, right? And the avenue through which a variety of areas of social action were channeled. The relative independence and the growing independence, and let's confine ourselves now to areas controlled by the government rather than the others, because these are we have two different patterns there. Are these not part of a larger process of the devolution of social authority, of political authority, and of economic authority to a variety of actors who come to exercise informal social control, in certain instances informal military or police control. So what is the broader process that we are seeing here? What is the broader process of disaggregation, which is in fact signaled by the rise in the number of, or the growing independence of religious organizations that deliver charity?
I guess that's the question that I try to answer in my research. What I try to highlight today is trying to answer that question is, yes, there is the illusion of state authority when it comes to the social field. But it seems to me that this is not only a process that is limited to that, it's not something that is coming out of nowhere in a civil war. It's not because the state has lost its monopoly of violence that its social authority is almost all of a sudden disappearing or dissipating. And it is associated with broader processes that were already undergoing after 2000. So there is, and this also opens up the possibility of asking questions about comparative studies and the way in which neoliberal economic schemes sort of were parallel with this kind of a devolution of social authority elsewhere. I know of some work that is done on the topic, comparatively speaking, and in one of the sources on the geography, it was the piece by Laura Ruiz de Alvira in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, where she does sort of point out how similar processes were happening in places like Saudi Arabia, even where you did have like the rise of these charity associations. And it's interesting that you mentioned the ideological output, because these charity associations did also have an ideological output. So yes, it is definitely something worth looking into. It's, for me at this point in time, it's a matter of how I limit or what's the scope of my research. To what extent can I go into these questions? Because they are very relevant, and also for our project, the function of my research is, I guess, to open these questions. Because what these demonstrate is, yes, there are specific patterns and developments happening in Syria, but there are similar patterns and processes happening elsewhere. So yeah, I don't know how far I can get with a competitive study, but it's definitely something worth looking into.
So along with economic deregulation, with neoliberalism comes social deregulation, so cultural regulation.
Well, that's what
Right. Yeah.
that's what it looks like.
Yeah. So one actually then needs to actually then think quite deliberately of the concept of informality, right? In relation to older patterns of social political analysis, or of analysis in the context of political economy. Thank you.
Thank you.
You mentioned the problems around the term neoliberalism, and you suggested it sort of starts in 2000. But and it seems there are two kind of key components. One is the withdrawal of subsidies and the withdrawal of state support, and then the second is the creation of a kind of quasi-private sector, this sort of crony capitalist private sector that emerges. But it seems to be that these two processes don't necessarily happen at the same time, because you see the withdrawal of subsidies, particularly in rural areas, starting in 1980 rather than in 2000. And by 2000, in fact, the state's support of the rural population has more or less evaporated. And along with that, a lot of the patronage channeled through Ba'athist structures is more or less over by the time Bashar takes over. What you see under him, of course, is the other side of the coin, which is the kind of creation of a more aggressive form of crony capitalism, which had always existed, but now gets completely liberated to do whatever it likes in terms of telecoms and banking and things like that. So it seems that it's actually a much longer period of kind of economic change
Than what I highlight.
yeah.
I agree with that. In the literature, the talk about economic opening, or intitah, so-called, starts from the days of Hafiz al-Assad. Through the currency crisis, the economic crisis that has happened already, and how the regime had already tried to sort of venture into the private sector, but in a very limited capacity. But also not limited in terms of how that limited opening was the foundation for when Bashar al-Assad came to power to expand and become what it is now. So, yes, I definitely should take that into account. But that probably takes another half an hour to talk about, maybe. So thank you for that.
Do you have any?
I mean, if we still have time, just to continue the discussion.
5 more minutes.
Yeah, I mean, not really so much as a question now to answer, but for us as a research group here. So when the way you framed it and the questions that came up about new social orders, the role of deregulation, the comparability of what is happening in Syria, which you align on and say at least we find certain parallels within the Middle East. So one other, of course, comparison for us is why is it then nevertheless that there is something specific to the Middle East in terms of deregulation and all of this, what happens, let's say, with another project we are kicking off now in post-socialist countries, right, where you have also a lot of parallel developments, where you also have a striking from the margin happening, but obviously there's something specific to the countries we are invested in, and we want to look at it. And my question is, do at this very early point, as we are still in the brainstorming and now focusing phase, so do we put more emphasis on looking at the various state structures and society, relationship to societies, or do we put the emphasis on the religion's components for what we are asking? In our formulation, and just looking at our beautiful logo, we start with deen, right, with religion and not with dawla, which may be just haphazard. But I think there is now the time, and also hearing how you are framing this, I think it's now a good time for us also to reflect on how do we see here the hierarchy of questions. I mean, it's extremely rich fields, and you really, I mean, also the last presentation that we had in your work is obviously giving us a big platform from where to work. But I think now is a good time to also think about, for us, where we want to put the accent, really, or in terms both of the Middle East frame that we have, but also with regard to non-Middle East historical experiences and what is going on, right? So if you want to accentuate this and see how we are defining that margin that is coming in. So not as a question, just as a comment to what we discussed.
But I think this is an important issue for post-lunch meeting, right?
Yeah.
So please join me in thanking Harout for his